Halo, saya Roli Kurniawan, Anda menyaksikan G20 Talks. Saat ini, dunia menghadapi krisis ketahanan pangan, ketidakpastian ekonomi global, dan juga geopolitik tension yang terjadi mengakibatkan sejumlah kebutuhan mengalami kenaikan harga dan juga pasokan yang terbatas. Bahkan sejumlah negara mulai menghadapi krisis ketahanan pangan. Dan pertemuan G20 diharapkan mampu memberikan solusi dan jalan keluar terhadap krisis ketahanan pangan global ini. Dan untuk membahas terkait dengan isu ini, bersama saya sudah hadir CEO and President of Athletic Council, Frederick Camp. Selamat pagi, Fred.
Selamat pagi, Ruli.
Perfecto. So, Fred, can you tell us a little bit about what is actually Atlantic Council's roles for the world?
So our mission is easy to state, hard to execute. It is shaping the global future together with partners and allies.
Right.
We've done that for 60 years. We're nonpartisan in the United States, and we're internationalists. We're called the Atlantic Council, but we're really the Global Atlantic Council.
So big roles, actually.
It's a really big role, and we have scholars, but we really like to work with practitioners, people who have been in government, people who are leading companies, people who are leaders in civil society and media, and trying to galvanize action around constructive U.S. leadership to shape a better future.
Okay. At Atlantic Council have a very exquisite forum here in Bali. So can you tell us a little bit, so what is the Atlantic Council Global Food Security Forum like in Bali? Right.
So first of all, we can do nothing without partners, and here are partners, the Gaurav and Sharon Srivastava Foundation. And what we're trying to do here ahead of the G20 is inform G20 leaders, give them the information they need to handle really the worst food security crisis. This is what the World Food Program says. The worst food security crisis in modern history. So it's worse than the last one we had between 2008 and 2012, and worse than the one we had 30 years before that, 1973-74. So first of all, you have a crisis, 73-74. It takes 30 years to have the next big food security crisis, and only 10 years after that to have the next one. And they're going to happen more rapidly, and they're going to be stronger unless we take public and private action to address the underlying causes.
Wow, that's a very big measures, right, about the food security. So why is the Atlantic Council hosting this forum? So what is the reason for that?
There are a few things that have come together. We already had the threat of a food security crisis because of climate change, which is a real problem for growing food, because of COVID-19, which interrupted supply chains. And then on top of that, we have Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, where tens of thousands of people have died, millions of people have been displaced, a war is underway, but the knock-on impact of the war is a food security crisis worldwide because Putin has weaponized food security in a way we haven't seen for decades.
So what is the hope behind this forum?
The hope behind this forum is that people will understand you cannot isolate food security from energy security from global security. All of these things hang together and have to come together. And that we have plenty of food. There's no problem with food. In fact, you've had a pretty good harvest in some major countries in the global south. The real question is that you have to change and make more secure the supply chain. You have to give more funding to small farmers in areas, and you have to influence countries not to use protectionism. When we faced this food crisis, when the prices started rising, India banned wheat exports. Other countries banned palm oil exports. Other countries banned the agrochemicals. And so what happened was it exacerbated a crisis that would have existed anyway, but became worse through protectionism and not common cause.
Okay, right. So how does addressing the challenge, like you said before, there's challenges out there of the food insecurity and intersect with the Atlantic Council's missions?
Well, our mission is to shape a better future. But you can do rhetoric, or you can do action.
Right.
And we are a results-oriented and action-oriented organization. And so we want to bring together not just people that will jawbone, as we say in the United States, the crisis, not just talk about the crisis, but come up with solutions. Our success will be at the end of the 13th, the day of the 13th, the end of our 2 days of deliberations, if we can come up with a list, a bullet point list of things that are most important to be taken care of now, things that are practical, things that can be done by the global community in partnership between the public sector and the private sector to ensure that we don't face this kind of hunger situation ever again. Right now, 800 million people in the world are newly at risk from hunger and food insecurity, and 323 people, 23 million people in the world are in dire risk, where they can't even afford to keep themselves well-fed in high nutrition. Even if the food were available, they couldn't pay for it. So, but the problem can be solved. $26 billion is what it would cost to do away with global hunger. $26 billion. That's 1% of the cash on hand of the 500 largest companies in the United States. Right. It's not that much. And so the global community can find that money. But what we're trying to do is galvanize action now. Let's not wait for the next food crisis.
Right. Actions first, right?
Right.
So you said before, millions of people are facing the food insecurity. So what is the major problems actually for these issues?
The problems are many, but the ones that we're focusing on most in this forum are climate, because we can look at those sorts of issues, and then how do we use technology, how do we use agri-technology, how do we use changes in agribusiness to address climate. Sometimes we just have to adapt. We have to accept that climate change is happening. We have to adapt to it. The second thing is the war. We can't hide the fact that by blocking off the ports of Ukraine, a lot of food is just not reaching the market. 1/3 of the world's wheat comes from Russia and comes from Ukraine. 1/3 of the world's wheat. Right. And so if that's blocked off, then you're already going to have hunger problems and food problems. So we'll look at those two issues. But there are a lot of other issues. The role of energy and the supply of energy. Inflation, where food suppliers can't even get the crops out of the port because inflation has gone so high, or the dollar has gone so high that in local currencies they can no longer afford what they had ordered before in terms of food. So there are a lot of different areas, but we're going to put climate and the war in Ukraine probably at the top of those issues.
Okay, that's really interesting elements what you said before. Okay, we're going to talk about the geopolitical tensions, but before that, you said earlier about the innovations and technology. So how important technology to overcome this crisis?
Technology is crucial to overcome a lot of different crises. Yes. If you look at the climate crisis, it could be our technologies that solve this faster than governments solve it. And I think in the agriculture world, that's also going to be the case. To produce more efficiently, to produce with less water, to produce with less waste. But then on top of that, you have inefficient governments, you have protectionism, but definitely the technology can help, but without governments and private sector working together effectively and addressing the supply chain, and there's not just a supply chain in technology, there's also a supply chain in food. Yes. And so you have to address all of it, but certainly improving the technological base of agribusiness is going to be a big part of this. Yeah.
Government is playing a very important role. So what should the government do to overcome the challenges of the global food insecurity?
First and foremost, it's recognizing that it exists, and also if you look back to the last crisis, 2008 to 2012, you had tens of millions of people fall into poverty who were not in poverty, and you had political unrest, political uprisings in at least a dozen different countries in the world. And so if you're in government, you don't want a food uprising. You don't want a political uprising. So first and foremost, it's recognizing that there's a danger that's not just one of hunger, but it's also one of political unrest. And then second of all, you have to understand that you as the government can't do it alone, but you can make the problem worse.
Yep.
And so you shouldn't stop your exports because of the crisis, because that's just going to make the crisis worse. And that's what happened in 2008, 2012. We shouldn't repeat that same problem now. And then it's doing something that's not going to solve the problem in the next 2 years, but for the next century. To really invest in the solutions, taking care of farmers, taking care of supply chains, taking care of technology, to realize that this is it's not a simple answer. It's going to be a number of different issues tied together. And then finally, that food security is part of energy security, is part of national security.
They're linked together. Right?
They're food security experts in the world. They're energy security experts in the world. And then they're military security experts in the world. And they don't talk to each other. The Atlantic Council brings these kinds of groups together because you cannot separate one from the other. You have to take care of all aspects of international security.
So that's what you're doing right now in Bali, right?
That's
make them together, working together. Right?
That's the overall purpose of the Atlantic Council, to create a more secure and more prosperous world where we are all working together better for humanity. And here in a microcosm, we're doing it in Indonesia this week.
And that's a very interesting element. But hold for a moment, karena G20 Talks akan segera kembali. It's really interesting. You know, like government is also, like you said earlier, is playing a big role, and also you said before about geopolitical tensions also become one of the major problems, you know, like about the food insecurities globally. Right. So how can national governments and multilateral bodies work to end these food insecurities?
They can make it an issue that gets a higher profile. And look, a lot of we're suffering a great deal from Putin's illegal war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But he's also done us a favor, because by weaponizing food security, he's put it on the global map as an issue that international organizations need to take care of. So that's good. And then you need politicians who understand how things hang together. We're working together in this forum with Minister Lahut, Minister Prabowo, wonderful ministers who understand the links. But Minister Prabowo isn't just the defense minister, he was also the head of the Farmers Association. And so he understands from his life story and from Indonesia and from the food dependence and the food insecurities of the past. This country has a history of food insecurity in the past. He understands very deeply these issues, and that his own defense portfolio can't be separated from a food security portfolio.
Role does United States and allied leadership play when it comes to the issue of global food security?
The United States has always been a galvanizing country at its best, a convening country. And sometimes one thinks about a superpower as military might, and certainly the United States has a defense capability that's perhaps unmatched in the world. But it also has a humanitarian capability that's unmatched in the world. The amount of money it gives to aid is extraordinary. And so what the U.S. can do is be a superpower convener of other countries at the G20 and other areas to take on food security as a part of security that has to be integrated with all aspects of international security.
Right, right. So in what ways is Indonesia an important partner for the United States in addressing the issue of the global food security?
So we have a saying in the United States about, when you want to set up a business, what are the three most important aspects for that business? And the answer is location, location, location.
Right.
And so Indonesia is located importantly. Indonesia's population is meaningful. Indonesia's leadership of the G20 with President Widodo shows that Indonesia wants to, aspires to be, and wants to be a global leader. And I think Indonesia knows from its own history the perils of food insecurity and also the benefits of food security. And so I think through its leadership, through its location,
Right.
and through its own knowledge of its history, I think Indonesia can play a leading role in food security rather than insecurity.
The IMF, the World Bank, and lots of major financial organizations predict that the 2023 we are facing a very big uncertainty about the financial growth globally. So, do you think like the Athletic Council can give like impact, like together all the stakeholders, important stakeholders, like to give us a very bright ideas to overcome the uncertainty that we are going to face in next year?
I hope so. Yeah. The forum. We have to be sober and not think that the Atlantic Council and the forum in the next 2 days is going to change the world. But on the other hand, if we don't try to, we're selling ourselves short. And so we are going to set ourselves a goal to come up with a bullet list of recommendations for the G20 that would really help solve this problem. I think what's key is you can't do it among governments of the G20. You can't do it just among businesses going after profits. Civil society, with all its best ideas, can't do it either. But you can do it with all of them working together, and that's really what the Atlantic Council is about with the Srivastava Foundation.
Yeah, because the predictions for the economic growth globally is only like 2%, right? So it's a major problem.
And 2% global growth is really recession.
Yes.
If you're under 3% in global growth, it's really recession. And then recession brings with it not just hunger, not just poverty, but it also brings political unrest. It brings extremism. It can breed fascism. And so it's everybody's interest to bring about sustainable growth, sustainable job creation.
That's going to be like our major problems that we are facing in the next year, right?
And my fear is it may get a little bit worse before it gets better. I think you're right that 2023 is going to be a cusp year. We've just seen new inflation figures in the United States. They're positive, but they need to be sustained. Can we slow down the inflation, return to economic growth, and make sure that this recession is a short one with a minimum of human pain that can be turned around? That's only going to happen through common cause at an organization like the G20.
Right, Urgensi, I believe that there are a lot of benefits within this G20 presidency in Indonesia, especially for the people in the grassroots. So how can national governments work to support local and grassroots solutions to fighting this global food security?
That is, to me, that's one of the most interesting questions, because at the same time that the United States government, the Indonesian government has to work in a global context, it must work in a local context. And I think
local is very important.
Local is really important. And one of the things, I'm not the world's leading expert on this, but one of the things that really interests me is the growth of large agricultural businesses had economies of scale. It had an ability to produce food perhaps more economically in some ways. But what have we lost through not giving enough support to the small farmer at the local and the regional level? I think the answer is we've lost a lot. And I think that a lot more security could be assured if one had both. You need the larger agribusinesses, but I think at the local level one has to do more to support the small local and regional farmers.
Food security is our main problems nowadays, but hold it for a moment karena G20 Talks akan segera kembali. So how is it important to focus in this global food insecurity problems? So why we have to focus in this problem?
We have a saying at the Atlantic Council: never let a crisis go to waste. So it's easier to change people's thinking in the middle of a crisis, and then the crisis goes away and people forget. We have a crisis. And it is a security crisis, it's an energy crisis, it's an inflation crisis, but it's also a food crisis and a hunger crisis. And it did not have to happen. And it was made worse by Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. I think what we have to understand is it's at a moment in crisis that you can actually galvanize international opinion and to a certain extent move decisions. And so I would be very disappointed if the G20 doesn't, among other things, come out with a couple of key decisions regarding food security.
So how about, how important is it to focus in the global food security in the global south?
Oh, that's what it's all about.
All right.
It's really, the global south is where the hunger is, but the global south is also where much of the production is.
Yes.
And the global south is neglected.
Neglected.
During COVID-19,
right.
the global south was neglected.
Right.
And so it's really interesting in the context of the war in Ukraine. You have Putin and a very small group of countries supporting his war. You know, North Korea, you know, Iran, a couple of others. And then you have 40 countries in the world that have joined the sanctions of the United States against Russia, against Putin. But then you have 140 countries or so that have neither joined Putin nor joined the sanctions, and most of them are in the global south. So in an economic situation, the global south is crucial and has been neglected, and in a political situation, the global south is saying, you know, what do I have to do with your war? You know, and I think you're seeing actually the return of a sort of non-aligned movement. It's a different non-aligned movement than during the Cold War, but it is a non-aligned movement nonetheless, and it's mostly made up of countries of the global south, which are saying, we're not so happy about the way all of you have been leading the world, and maybe we should take a crack at it.
We should take the crack at it. All right. That's a good question, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, so so how can government, you said before, like every stakeholders must stick together and you like to overcome these problems. So how can government support the private sector to develop solutions to fighting the global food security?
First of all, by not making the situation worse.
Okay.
And so by export bans are just the worst thing I can possibly think about. And you know, I mentioned earlier the Brazilian ban of wheat exports. And I think there was also a ban of agrochemicals from another country, and there's a ban also on palm oil from a couple of other countries. And so first of all, don't make the situation worse.
Right.
And then second of all, create incentives. One is always creating incentives for manufacturing of a car factory in your area, or bringing in a semiconductor factory. But why not create more incentives for agriculture investments as well? And so I think by creating incentives and to a certain extent getting out of the way so that private farmers can do their jobs best, and so that the supply chains can actually be created in a meaningful way.
Right, right. And Indonesia is well known for its agricultures, actually.
Yeah.
So how can Indonesia become a strategic player in the global food security supply chain, like you said?
First of all, by hosting the G20 meeting.
Right.
Second of all, by realizing it's, I think Indonesia is a country that has been growing in international influence, but I think it could take on even more international leadership. Right. And I would say on this issue in particular, Indonesia has a great starting point because of the knowledge from its history and then its position in the region. The way that you lead is by bringing ideas that others can embrace, and the other way you lead is not to be seen as, and sometimes the United States falls into the mistake, thinking too much about itself.
Right.
And one must think about, think a little bit more about the international common good. And that's the way one becomes a global leader. And I think there's many aspects of Indonesian leadership that are going in this direction.
Yeah, like you said earlier, don't neglect others.
Yeah.
That's going to be the important roles, right?
Do no harm.
Do no harm.
Do great good.
Do great good. And hopefully the Atlantic Council do that good deeds, good things, like to help other governments, like stakeholders and other stakeholders to give insight for a better purpose.
What we try to do is create an environment where people can come together and talk about these issues, not in an academic manner, but in a real world manner, where we will press people towards solutions. It's not enough
press people for the solutions.
Yeah, it's not enough. It's not enough just to intellectually understand the problem. That's a great first step. But the second step is then to prescribe solutions that can actually work in the real world, not solutions that may look good on paper that are but are impossible to execute in the world that we inhabit, which has domestic politics, which has different interests, which has economies where people need to make profits. So we have to accept the world as it is, and then seek solutions within that.
Find the solutions. Well, once again, Fred, thank you very much for your insight. Hopefully we'll give a better impact to facing the global food securities that we are facing today. And good luck with the forum here in Bali.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Great.
And I hope we do credit to the location.
Once again, Fred, thank you very much for your time and your insight for the better world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Demikian perbincangan saya dengan Frederick Kam, Presiden and CEO of Atlantic Council di G20 Talks kali ini. Terima kasih, saya Beli Kurniawan, sampai jumpa.